Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Mesechet Orlah. We are up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'il Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. Just as an introduction, the Torah tells us in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 19, Psukim 23 to 25, V'chi tavor la'aretz untatem kol etz ma'achal. When you shall come to the land, you shall plant any food tree. V'araltem orlatot priyo shalosh shanim yelechem arilim lo ya'achel. You shall treat as closed its orlah, its fruit, for 3 years. It shall be closed for you. It shall not be eaten. The Mishnah today is going to discuss what we can learn from the words, when you shall come to the land and you shall plant any food tree. At the time that our forefathers led by Yeshua entered the land of Israel, Matzu Natua, if they found a tree already planted, even if it was not yet 3 years old, Patur, it is exempt from Orlah, because the Rav says, the Torah writes, Orlah will apply when you shall come to the land and you shall plant. This excludes any fruit tree planted before you came to the land. Therefore it is Patur, it is exempt from Orlah. Natu afalpi shelo kabshu. However, if they planted a tree after they entered the land, even before conquering all of it, chayav, the tree was subject to Orlah. Now the Mefarshim explain, whereas many other mitzvot of Eretz Yisrael did not go into effect until after Yeshua conquered the entire land and divided it among the Bnei Yisrael, right, a process that took 14 years, the Orlah obligation took effect as soon as they entered the land. This is because the Torah says, when you shall come to the land, you shall plant any fruit tree. The word any comes to include any tree that is planted after you come to the land, even if it was planted by a non-Jew, and even if it was planted before the entire land was conquered and divided. Hanotea larabim chayav. If someone plants a tree in his own property for the public to use the fruit, it is subject to Orlah. Now the Mefarshim explain, understood simply, the Torah's expression, you shall plant, refers to the usual type of planting, which is where an individual person plants on his own land for his own use. However, the pasuk goes on to say about the Orlah fruit that for 3 years it shall be forbidden lachem, to you in the plural sense, right? An extra expression. That comes to expand the halakha to include even a tree planted on private property for public use of the fruit. Rabbi Yehuda poter, however, Rabbi Yehuda exempts it from Orlah. Rabbi Yehuda holds that even the pasuk's first expression, untatem, the plural sense of you shall plant, it implies a broadening of the law to include public use of the fruit. Therefore, the later expression of shall be forbidden lachem, to you in the plural sense, which once again broadens the law to public use of the fruit, that makes it a case of ribuya charibuy, an inclusion after an inclusion, and the rule is that a ribuya charibuy means only to restrict the law. So in this case, it restricts the law only to where the tree is planted for private use of the fruit, right? It's basically one of the forms of learning, and ribuya charibuy el lema'et, right? A broadening after a broadening comes only to restrict. But the Tanakam, however, holds that the plural is used in the first part of the pasuk, not as a broadening, but because this pasuk speaks to the entire nation. If any of you plant, right? This is the more reasonable way to understand the pasuk, since planting is usually done by individuals. Now, that's the disagreement between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. And the Rav tells us, Ven elachak Rabbi Yehuda, the Halakha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. The Mishnah concludes with other cases in which Orlah applies. If someone plants a tree in the public domain for his own use, or if an idolater planted a tree, or if a robber stole land and planted a tree on it, or if someone plants a tree in a boat, or if a tree sprouted on its own in a private domain, chayav be'orlah. In all of these cases, the tree is subject to Orlah. Let us go back to explain one by one. Again, we said, if someone plants a tree in the public domain for his own use, which Mefarshim explain, This is like a normal planting, and that's done by an individual for his own use, and therefore the law of Orlah applies to it, even though he's doing it in a public domain. And the next case, if an idolater planted a tree, this applies whether he planted it on a Jew's property or even if he did so on his own property, because like we mentioned, the extra word, any food tree, comes to include even one that was planted by a goy, by an idolater. And the next case, if a robber stole land and planted a tree on it. Now, even though the Mishnah already taught that a tree planted in public domain is subject to Orlah, it still had to teach that the same applies to a tree planted on stolen property, because otherwise one might have thought the halacha of Orlah, the law of Orlah, is extended only to a tree planted in the public domain, because since like the planter, like everyone else, they have a share in the public domain. But planting on stolen property, you might have thought altogether is different, because the planter doesn't own that property at all. And therefore the Mishnah teaches that Orlah applies even in the case of a robber who plants on stolen property. If somebody plants a tree in a boat, this again is referring, the Mefarshim explain, is referring to planting a tree in an earthenware boat filled with earth. Since the boat is made of earthenware, the tree's roots will eventually puncture the bottom of the boat and draw nourishment from the ground beneath. The tree is therefore treated as though it was growing from the ground and is therefore subject to Orlah. If a tree sprouted on its own in a private domain, which although this tree wasn't planted at all, it's still similar to usual planting in that it's growing in an individual's domain and will be used by him. And again, chayav be'Orlah, in all of these cases, the tree is subject to Orlah. That is an Abotai Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel now discusses a tree that was uprooted and replanted. When is this considered a new planting that you have to count now a new 3 years of Orlah? Ilan shenekar v'asela imo. If a tree that was more than 3 years old was uprooted, like in a storm, together with the soil rock, meaning the clump of earth that hardens around the roots of a tree, and it remains stuck to the roots when the tree is pulled from the ground. So it went with it, right? The soil rock went with it, and then you replanted it in the ground. It became replanted in the ground. Shitafo nar v'asela imo. Or if a river swept it away together with the soil rock, and the tree became replanted in a new location, that is like this. Im yachol lichyot patur. If it could have survived by drawing nourishment from just that soil rock with no additional earth, it is exempt from Orlah, because as if it was never uprooted from the earth in which it was growing. If the soil rock that remained attached to the tree is large enough by itself to sustain the tree, then the tree has never been separated from the earth in which it was growing, and it was as if the tree was never uprooted. Now, the Mefarshim bring down here, the article brings down the Chazon Ish. According to the Chazon Ish, the soil rock doesn't have to be able to sustain the tree for 3 years, but only until the tree is able to strike new roots in its new location. But in any event, the Mishnah continues, Vim lav chayav. But if it could have not survived without the additional earth in which it was replanted, then it's considered to have been uprooted and is subject to 3 years of Orlah. Once more, it is like a new tree. It's like a tree that sprouted on its own in the new location, which, like we taught in the previous Mishnah, we said va'oleh me'elav. If its tree sprouts on its own, then it's subject to Orlah. The Mishnah now applies these laws to where a tree that was more than 3 years old became uprooted without moving from its place at all. If some of the soil rock became separated from the tree's side by a storm or flood waters, or because the ground shifted for some other reason, now the tree itself was not uprooted, but part of its soil rock became separated from it, so that it no longer draws nourishment from the separated part. Or if a plow hit and shook it, causing some of the soil rock to separate from the tree, or if he shook it until he made the soil rock like loose earth, meaning loosened earth doesn't nourish the tree as well as the soil rock, and then he repacked the soil around the roots. In any of these cases, the halakha is like this. Im yachol lichyot patur. If the tree could have survived as is without the additional earth that was repacked around it, then it's exempt from Orlah, because it's as if it was never uprooted from the earth in which it was growing. Vim lav chayav. But if it could have not survived without the additional earth that was repacked around it, it is subject to a new count of Orlah, because it's considered to be a tree that was uprooted and then replanted. Now, the article that points out here, most commentaries, the Rambam, the Rosh, the Rash, the Melechet Shlomo, the Tosfot Yom Tov, and the Rav as well, they have a slightly different reading in our Mishnah. Instead of reading O shezizeo vaso ke'afar, or if he shook it until he made the soil rock like loose earth, they read it be'afar, and he restored it with earth, meaning the storm or shaking dislodged some of the soil rock, exposing the roots, and the person then covered and packed them with earth. If the tree could have survived without the new earth, it's not considered to have been replanted. And that is an Abu Taib today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.